The wind howled through the streets of the city, making it feel even colder than it actually was. Greg Matthews, a struggling single dad, sat in his worn-out car watching his 10-year-old daughter Sophie through the rearview mirror as she fell asleep in the back seat. Greg had always done his best to provide for her, but lately things had been tough. His mechanic shop was barely making enough money to pay the bills, and they'd been staying in the car for the last few nights after he couldn't afford to keep their apartment. As he sat there, staring at the city skyline, he noticed a young woman on the street corner. She was bundled in a thin jacket, shivering from the cold, and looked lost. Greg hesitated. He was a stranger in this city too, struggling to make ends meet, but something about the girl's vulnerable expression tugged at his heart. He rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The girl looked up, startled, then slowly approached the car. I don't have anywhere to go," she said quietly. Greg didn't think twice. "Get in," he said. "I have room for one more." The girl, whose name was Emily, climbed into the car with a sigh of relief. Greg could tell she was exhausted, her clothes dirty and torn, but she still looked like she was trying to hold it together. As they drove to a nearby diner to get some food, Greg learned that she had been living on the streets for weeks. Her family had disowned her, and she had no place to go. Greg's heart ached for her. He remembered what it felt like to have no one to turn to. When they arrived at the diner, Sophie woke up and looked at the girl with curiosity. Greg smiled softly, trying to reassure his daughter. "Sophie, this is Emily. She's going to stay with us for a little while." Sophie nodded shyly, but smiled in return. Greg hadn't thought much about it, but he felt a strange sense of responsibility for Emily, knowing she had nowhere else to go. He made a promise to himself. He would help her, even if he barely had enough to help himself. Greg's car wasn't the best place for a long-term solution, so he invited Emily to stay with them at the small, run-down house he had rented with his meager savings. It wasn't much, just a couple of rooms with old furniture and peeling paint, but it was safe and warm. Emily was hesitant at first, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of accepting charity. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg shook his head. "You're not a burden. We're all just trying to get by, right? You can stay as long as you need." Sophie, ever the friendly one, immediately offered Emily the spare bed. Greg watched them bond as Sophie told Emily about her favorite toys, and soon the tension between them melted away. That night, Emily slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Greg knew they had made the right decision, even if it meant making sacrifices. Over the next few days, Emily began to adjust to her new surroundings. Greg continued working at his mechanic shop, and Sophie went to school as usual. Emily helped out around the house, cleaning, cooking, and even looking after Sophie when Greg had to work late. It wasn't much, but the small acts of kindness meant a lot. Greg couldn't help but notice how Emily seemed to take care of Sophie like an older sister, always looking out for her. One evening, as Greg and Emily sat at the kitchen table, Greg learned more about her past. Emily revealed that she had once come from a wealthy family, living in a big house with all the luxuries one could imagine. But things had taken a dark turn when her parents had become controlling and abusive. She had eventually left, hoping to find her own way in the world. Greg listened quietly, understanding that Emily wasn't just running from homelessness. She was running from a painful past. As the weeks went by, Emily became more comfortable living with Greg and Sophie. They had created a small family unit, bound by the shared struggles of life. Greg didn't ask too many questions about Emily's past, respecting her need for privacy but there were moments when he saw glimpses of the world she had come from, brief flashes of her former life, like when she casually mentioned her time spent at a prestigious school or the way she used her phone. But Emily always downplayed it, shrugging it off as if it meant nothing. One day, while Greg was fixing a car at his shop, Emily showed up unexpectedly. She had a small smile on her face, but Greg could tell something was different. "What's going on?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Emily hesitated, then handed him an envelope. "I don't know how to explain this, but this is for you," she said quietly. Greg opened the envelope, revealing a check for an absurdly large amount of money. He stared at it in shock. "What is this, Emily?" he asked, his voice shaking. Emily's eyes dropped to the floor. "I never told you, but I'm not just anyone. My family, they're wealthy. I have more money than I know what to do with. I want to help you." Greg couldn't believe what he was hearing. The girl he had taken in, the one who had seemed so vulnerable and helpless, was the heir to a fortune he couldn't even imagine. He stared at the check, torn between shock, confusion, and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with a mix of emotions. "I didn't want you to think I was just another rich girl trying to fix things with money," Emily replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I've lived on my own for a while now, and I've learned that money isn't everything. What matters is kindness and finding people who care about you." Greg looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. Emily wasn't the person he had expected. She wasn't flaunting her wealth or asking for handouts. Instead, she had chosen to help others in her own quiet way. Greg sat alone in his small living room, the check still in his hands. He couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of him wanted to accept Emily's offer, to take the money and fix all his financial problems. But another part of him, the part that had spent his entire life working hard to provide for Sophie, felt like he couldn't take it. He didn't want to seem like he was using Emily or taking advantage of her kindness. That evening, he sat down with Sophie and explained what had happened. Sophie, always wise beyond her years, looked at him and said, "Dad, maybe it's okay to accept help sometimes. We help Emily, and she helps us. We're a team." Greg smiled, appreciating his daughter's simple but powerful perspective. That night, he decided to swallow his pride. He would use the money to get back on his feet, but only if Emily didn't feel like it was charity. They were family now. Greg used the money from Emily to pay off his debts and make repairs to his mechanic shop. Things started to turn around. Business picked up, and he even hired an extra hand to help around the shop. It wasn't the life of luxury, but it was a stable life. A life that allowed him to provide for Sophie and make plans for their future. Emily continued to stay with them, offering support whenever she could, but never making it feel like she was doing everything for them. One day, Greg sat down with Emily at the kitchen table. "I want to thank you for everything," he said, his voice sincere. "You've changed our lives. But I also want you to know we're here for you too. No more secrets. You don't have to do this alone." Emily smiled, her eyes tearing up a little. "I don't feel alone anymore," she said softly. "This is the first time I've felt like I belong." As time passed, the bond between Greg, Sophie, and Emily grew stronger. They became a real family. Sophie would help Emily bake cookies in the kitchen, and Greg would teach Emily about car repairs in the garage. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating memories and a life filled with love. The small house they lived in was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a home. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table laughing and sharing stories, Greg looked at Emily with a new sense of appreciation. "You know," he said, his voice full of warmth, "I never would have guessed that a chance meeting would turn into this. You're not just a guest in our home, Emily. You're family." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I feel the same way," she said, taking Sophie's hand. "I'm so lucky to have found you both." One day, as they were finishing dinner, Emily received an unexpected phone call. She stepped into the other room to take it, and when she returned, her face was a little pale. Greg noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emily hesitated before speaking. "I just got off the phone with my lawyer. My family, they want me to return to them. They want me to take over the family business." Greg could see the internal struggle in her eyes. "I don't want to go back to that life," she continued, shaking her head. "But I don't know if I can ignore my responsibilities." Greg put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You have to do what feels right for you, Emily. No matter what happens, we're here for you. You don't owe anyone anything." Emily smiled weakly. "I know. I just wish things were simpler." Over the next few days, Emily grappled with the decision of whether or not to return to her family's business. She spent hours thinking, weighing her options, and talking to Greg. Finally, one evening, she sat down with him and Sophie. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. "I'm not going back to that life. I don't need the money or the power. What I need is to build my own future with people who care about me." Greg smiled, proud of her strength. "You've already built something incredible, Emily. This," he gestured around their small home, "this is your future. We're a family, and that's more important than anything." Sophie nodded, her eyes full of love. "We'll always have a home for you, Emily," she said. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart full of gratitude. Months passed, and life continued to improve for Greg, Sophie, and Emily. With Emily's decision to stay, she became a permanent part of their family. She started working at a local charity, helping homeless people like she had once been, using her knowledge and compassion to make a difference. Greg's mechanic shop continued to thrive, and Sophie excelled in school, always surrounded by the love of her new family. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Greg put his arm around Emily. "You made the right choice," he said softly. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, smiling. "I think so too." The three of them looked out over the horizon, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever.